Order, good afternoon and welcome to the Women and Equalities Select Committee. Today we will be looking at equality at work, miscarriage, bereavement leave. In our first panel today, we will be hearing from Vicki, the Chief Executive of Miscarriage Association, Munira, Chief Executive of the Ectopic Pregnancy Trust, and Dr. Jessica Farren, Consultant Gynaecologist at UCL Hospitals. Thank you and welcome today. So I am going to start with Christine.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming to join us today. One of the things that the government's 2023 pregnancy loss review showed was that there was still a taboo, that pregnancy wasn't, loss of pregnancy wasn't spoken about much. The TUC, the NHS, have also referred to this. So I wonder if I could ask Vicki and Jessica, first of all, to what extent do you think the taboos and stigma around miscarriage and pregnancy loss are still a barrier to women and their partners receiving support in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely, the taboo still exists. I think we are starting to see some changes, but absolutely for sure it is there. People who experience this still tell us that they experience a real sense of isolation. They don't feel able to talk about it publicly. They don't feel it's acknowledged. The impact is not acknowledged or recognised. We still have this kind of archaic 12-week rule that is imposed on people that they shouldn't disclose their pregnancy before that time in case something goes wrong. But if you haven't felt able to disclose it, it's very hard then to kind of seek support for that. So I think it's incredibly unhelpful. And that in itself then kind of, specifically, we're talking about the workplace today, has an implication in the workplace because people don't feel able to disclose their loss at work.
Yeah, and I would add to that, time and time again, I meet women who really don't want their workplace to know that they were pregnant and that they're potentially trying for a baby for fear that it might have an impact on their career progression at work if people know that they're soon likely to be having extended maternity leave. And
yet we like to think that we've moved away from that sort of culture, but you think it's still quite
absolutely
prevalent.
So as an example, I whenever I'm doing surgical management of miscarriage, I will offer patients a sick note, and I will always ask patients whether they want me to disclose that it's for miscarriage or they want me to put something vague, like a kind of gynaecological issue. And I would say it's still 50-50 people choosing for me to write gynaecological issue without disclosing that they were pregnant, in spite of the fact that they're obviously better protected if we disclose the fact that it was pregnancy loss related.
I wonder then if I could ask Munira and Vicki, do you think Baby Loss Awareness Week has been effective, or how effective do you think it's been in challenging the sort of taboos and stigma that we've talked about, and is leading to kind of a more supportive attitude in the workplace?
Thank you. I think that anything that raises awareness among the public is helpful. I think there is an increased dialogue because of initiatives like Baby Loss Awareness Week. We would hope that that then translates into the workplace, although in spite of that there are still instances that we come across where things don't go smoothly in the workplace. But we would hope that through initiatives like Baby Loss Awareness Week, the stigma starts to get challenged and barriers break down.
I'd agree with all that, but I also would say that that's just 1 week a year. We're very good at talking about it during that 1 week in October. What we're not seeing is companies and society generally talking about it much beyond that. And, we as a charity, and we're very happy to support businesses who want to raise awareness during that week or have training during that week. But we always say to them, please don't just talk about it in October. It's about creating that supportive environment that it can be spoken about all year round and people feel supported throughout the 12 months.
Do you think the balance is shifting at all from businesses being completely unaware to being totally aware? It is improving?
I think there are some improvements for sure. I think that businesses who recognise it, a lot of them do a really good job, and they have great policies in place, and they have training for managers, and they have guidance in place, but they're still in the minority. There's still far too many women and their partners who don't have good employers or are having to rely on having an empathetic supervisor or manager rather than there being something systemic in place for them to be able to access and know what their rights are and what they're entitled to.
Just following on from that, we've heard from women who've been affected that one of the things that's missing is guidance on, what they can expect at work. And guidance for workplaces as well, both for mothers and fathers. They don't know what the guidance is, but they also find that their employers, even though they might want to be supportive, don't know what the guidance is. Is that your experience?
I think so. Lots of women say to us, particularly if it's the first time they've been pregnant or the first time they've had a loss, they don't know what they're entitled to. They don't know what's reasonable. What's a reasonable time to have off work? What can they reasonably ask of their employer? Is it sick leave? Is it a bereavement? They just don't know, because we don't talk about it, and most companies don't have policies in place. There's very little in terms of, the kind of bereavement leave policy in general. It barely mentions miscarriage. So it's just, it's no surprise that it compounds the experience for people. They're already having a terrible experience. They've already lost their baby. They've been told their baby's died. And one of the first questions they often present to us after we've talked about their feelings is, well, what do I do about work? They just don't know.
Can I possibly just add to that as well as an example? As the NHS as an organisation, you'll all be aware in the headlines in March was the fact that the NHS England had adopted the policy of bereavement leave after pregnancy loss. And I have since treated 3 NHS employees for miscarriage, and none of them have been aware of any policy related to it. So I think there's also an issue with these sort of policies get made and yet they don't filter down.
On that, the other thing I wondered, Munira, you might want to answer, what impact the introduction of formal baby loss certificates had on challenging that taboo and stigma, and, if you like, making it a more tangible thing to take to employers, or to just break down the stigma?
That's a very interesting question in the sense that you use the word tangible, and with pregnancy...
I think another one.
No, I think it's very appropriate in that certainly for the gestation of losses that we deal with at the Ectopic Pregnancy Trust, there is very little tangible to remember a pregnancy by. Typically, ectopic pregnancies occur prior to 12 weeks, usually around the 6 to 7 week mark. Some women may have not disclosed, as Vicki alluded to, that they are pregnant. They may not even know themselves that they are pregnant, and then they find out that they're having an ectopic pregnancy. And so I think the word that you used in terms of tangible is very appropriate, because there isn't very much with these certificates. Certainly from our audience, we found that there was a recognition that there was an experience here, that there is a loss here, and that helps them have something to remember and commemorate their experiences by. What I would add to that, though, it is still in the private sphere. It's up to an individual to choose to have a certificate or not. It's not a legally applicable document, and so there isn't anything that's associated with that would necessarily help within the workplace. It's simply an important recognition for the person of the experience that they've gone through.
Thank you very much.
Just come in and say, just on that, just to give you some context, the last time I checked in with that, over 80,000 of those certificates had been issued. And as Munira said, there's no legal status. To some extent, there's no benefit to having one, apart from it's a validation that you've experienced a loss. So hopefully you can see from that how important that is to people.
That's quite a startling figure, yes. 80,000. Thank you very much. I also apologise, I'm going to have to leave the session for a bit, but I didn't want you to think I was just running out. But thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Christine. I wanted to pick up on that point of the baby loss certificates. Vicki, do you think that there is a danger in policy from government now looking a little bit contradictory to issue baby loss certificates to recognise the loss while also not allowing parents and families the time to grieve?
I think it feels a little bit token. We'll make a concession, we'll give you a certificate, we'll give you a piece of paper, but we won't back that up with some policy that says, actually, you can have some time off work. This can be felt as a bereavement by a great many people. So I think it's a really important step, and it has been welcomed by so many people, but I think it doesn't go far enough in and of itself.
Thank you. And Dr. Farren, I just wanted to ask, you said it was 50-50 between women wanting to disclose the real reasons why it was that they were coming to see you for the medically managed miscarriage treatments. Do they say why it is? Is it that they are fearful that their employer will treat them differently, or is it that they are fearful that their employer will take punitive steps?
As a general rule, I don't think I go into the details. I think there's just a kind of acceptance in the conversation I have that it would be a reasonable attitude for your employer not to want to know, which is probably gives you an indication as to the problem that it's understood that you might not want to divulge that, and I'm not inclined to ask any more questions about why.
Thank you. Thank you, Kirith.
Thank you, Chair. My question is for you, Dr. Farren. Your study found prevalence of psychological conditions, including PTSD, anxiety, lasting for months after miscarriage and ectopic pregnancies. How and why do these conditions emerge, and how could the risks be better mitigated?
Well, I think it's really important to start by saying that the reactions to pregnancy loss are very diverse, and there will be a group of people who are fine after miscarriage and ectopic pregnancy, but it's a tiny minority who are absolutely fine. For most people, it is something, and for some people, it is everything. I think that's an old Miscarriage Association saying. And what my research very clearly demonstrated is that there's a sector of people who meet criteria for one of the most severe psychiatric diagnoses you can come across, which is PTSD. So we had a rate of 29% at 1 month, 23% at 3 months, dropping to 18% at 9 months, which is huge and actually not that much of a decline over time. Yeah. I think what you have to remember with that is that actually that's just showing the kind of tip of the iceberg, because beneath that, there's still, when we looked at the kind of, when you analyse for PTSD, you look at a whole host of questions, and you have to meet sort of criteria within each of these different sort of sections in order to meet the criteria. But 70% of people reported symptoms that are having an impact on their day-to-day life at 1 month. So it's not just the psychiatric conditions; it's the people beneath that are suffering in all sorts of different ways. You know, having an impact on their relationship at home, at work. And I think the really scary bit is when you think of the potential impact sort of on their family life at large, and potentially sort of future generations from the morbidity that's out there.
If I may just add to that, on my way to the committee this morning, I had an email came into my inbox on the train from a woman who'd gone back to work today, and she's 1 month post her treatment for ectopic pregnancy, and asking for help. She's been tearful throughout the day. She's not having the support that she feels that she needs, and she's reached out to us, and that happened this very morning.
Yeah.
Can I just ask a question related to that? That 1 month obviously is that the first period post a miscarriage is incredibly traumatic and can be incredibly traumatic. How are you finding that employers are understanding of the ongoing impacts of miscarriage past that initial kind of 2 weeks?
Is that to me specifically?
Yes, to you, yeah.
I think it's fair to say we see a range of different approaches. I think one of the tricky things with ectopic pregnancy is, sadly, the terms miscarriage and stillbirth are familiar, and they're heartbreaking and devastating in their own ways. With ectopic pregnancy, we have to go a step before that, and a lot of people don't even know what the condition is. So with an ectopic pregnancy, it's often an emergency situation, and there are lots of things that happen in a very short space of time. The woman herself is just about processing what's going on, and then thinking about work, and the sorts of conversations that she might need to be having at work is another level of complexity. And then you're thinking about the workplace, and when you walk in there, what to share, what not to share, as Jess helpfully alluded to earlier. And when that experience is shared in the workplace, we have examples where care is good, and you've got empathic members of the team who are supportive, where conversations can be had openly. But we also have examples where, for example, one had an instance where a conversation with her doctor was overheard, and the statement was that her employer suggested that she might be lying about the extent of what she was going through. Another example is a woman was told, oh, you don't need that long. You don't need that long after a miscarriage. So we hear a mixed bag, I think it's safe to say, and we would hope that an initiative can help with more positive experiences in the workplace.
Thanks, Munira. Kira, sorry.
That's okay, thank you, Chair. What are some of the sort of physical and emotional impacts, and you sort of touched on this already, Munira, but of the less known sort of types of pregnancy loss, including molar and ectopic pregnancies?
Sure. I start by saying that I am here representing many of the women who speak to us, and I'm grateful to them for sharing their experiences to enable me to reference them here. Yeah. So the sorts of things that we hear about in terms of the physical aspect, there are 3 main treatments for ectopic pregnancy, and I think it's safe to say they're all incredibly difficult in their own way. Most commonly, because it's an emergency situation, most commonly the experience of treatment is through surgery, and of course that's traumatic to the body, and a very fast decision making is required to save the woman's life. With non-surgical treatment, there is the ongoing risk of rupture and also the worries around that. There are repeated hospital visits which are demanding, they can be triggering for people, and until those hormone levels fall, you're not really fully out of the woods. Yeah. And that can be a dark cloud that really overshadows for weeks, months on end. Touching upon the emotional aspects, certainly there can be the grief that's associated with losing the pregnancy. And with ectopic pregnancy, there's also often the loss of a fallopian tube as well. And there's a grief that's associated with a loss of part of your reproductive system. Yeah. There is anger, there's blame often, and there can be very confusing emotions in the sense of even a sense of relief that they've had the treatment and they're alive. So there are lots of complicated emotions to navigate for not just weeks, I would say, for months afterwards.
Thank you. And to what extent does the fact that many employers might not have heard of those types of pregnancies before make it more difficult for employees? And just following that as well, what more do you think the government could do and the NHS to try and raise awareness about some of those sort of types of pregnancies?
The awareness point is an incredibly important one, and in fact the Embrace report just recently again repeated the need for awareness among healthcare professionals and clinicians around ectopic pregnancy. And this is not the first time the Embrace report has referenced that. The prior report 2 years ago also said the same thing. So that message is something that's coming out loud and clear from the Embrace team, and which we would fully endorse. Awareness is very much needed around ectopic pregnancy and indeed molar pregnancy. The second part to your question was about employers, I believe, and the barriers to that. Yeah. And I covered part of that earlier in the sense that not even knowing what the condition is means that there's a level of explanation that the individual has to go into, reliving and going over a very difficult experience and trying to find the words to express that to their colleagues. And we certainly do our best to speak with employers to try and help them understand where their colleagues have come from in the immediate aftermath and afterwards following an ectopic pregnancy.
Thank you. And what do you think we could be doing better as the government, or perhaps maybe the NHS might be doing to try and sort of help increase that awareness and try and allow employers to access some sort of information that might increase that awareness around these sorts of pregnancies?
I would want to ensure that through all the narrative around leave provisions, that the term ectopic pregnancy is expressly used. That visibility really counts. A lot of the time ectopic pregnancy is conflated with miscarriage, and I would say they're both heartbreaking, difficult experiences in their own right, but I would say that they are different. And it's important to recognise that there is a cohort of women who experience miscarriage and their needs need to be addressed. And there's also women who've experienced ectopic pregnancy and they need to be seen and recognised in the narrative and in the communications.
Thank you, Kirith. Rachel, did you want to come in on these points? No? David?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for coming in today, all three of you. Vicki, one particularly for you. So we recently heard from some women who shared their experiences, and one thing that struck me was the impact that they all brought up the impact this had on their partners, and we often forget that. So from your experience and from the people you've worked with, what are the emotional impacts of pregnancy and baby loss on partners?
I think you're absolutely right, and we haven't always been great at considering the partners in this. And I think that we talked about ectopic pregnancy there. I think there's a tendency to kind of medicalise miscarriage and ectopic pregnancy and pregnancy loss generally, which means that it's often seen as being a women's issue and not being a couple's issue or a family's issue. The partners can be, and Jess did some research on this as well, so she might want to come in on that, but partners can be very significantly affected by it on lots of different levels. They haven't had the physical loss, obviously, but they have lost a pregnancy or a baby too. It has, it can have a very significant emotional impact on them. And it's often a conception, I think, that, they need time off work to support their partner. But it's not just about that. It is obviously about that, and they will want to be there to support their partner. But it's also for their own mental health and well-being as well, that they will need that time to, kind of come to terms with what has happened. We talk to partners a lot who express a whole gamut of feelings, but often they feel quite helpless because they're not able to. So often they're not able to physically be there, but they're not able to take the pain and the hurt away from what their partner's experiencing. But they also feel that their feelings are invalid, that they didn't have the physical loss, so they shouldn't be entitled to have these sorts of feelings. And I think, again, we as a society sort of talk to partners and we'll say, how is your partner doing? Or here are some flowers for your partner. It's not really kind of fully yet recognised that there are two and sometimes more people in this loss.
Dr. Farren, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I can tell you some of the statistics from the study. We had a much smaller group of partners involved, and perhaps their lack of involvement reflects their kind of sense that they don't necessarily have a right to engage in the research, because their response rates were much lower. Generally, the levels of psychological morbidity sat much lower than in women. And it's not entirely clear what that is, why that is. It might be because of sort of societal expectations on them, which I think is the most likely cause, or it may be something different kind of about the physical experience or the hormonal experience that makes a difference. But I think it's clear, and I would echo that there is impact, and I would echo what Vicki said in terms of that powerlessness being really key. And I have met a number of partners over my many years in sort of clinical practice who the sort of witnessing of their partner going through a life-threatening situation, which, let's not forget, occasionally these events is deeply, deeply traumatic.
Absolutely. So, Vicki, what do you think could be done? What more can be done to recognise the effects on partners and supporting them in the workplace?
I think it's all the things we talked about, but recognising that for them it is also a loss. They have had this loss. I think for employers particularly to recognise that they will need time off and to support that time off. Again, not just to be there for medical appointments or to be there for their partner, but to start their own recovery process as well. And Jess alluded to that, and Munira as well. Often in an experience like this, there are an awful lot of follow-up appointments as well. And so please do also, employers should be supporting those appointments, because there can be lots of invasive tests afterwards, follow-up appointments, particularly if people are having recurrent loss as well. And these can be traumatic experiences for people, and we talked about them being triggering. So to be able to have their spouse with them, to be able to support that as well. I think in any legislation that comes forward, it's absolutely crucial that partners are included in that.
Thank you, Vicki and Jessica. Well, all three of you, we heard from some very brave women that shared their experiences and what happens when they're having to go to these medical appointments. Just by themselves. Jessica, you talked about the medical management of miscarriage. For example, DNCs or emergency surgeries for ectopic pregnancies will require general anaesthetic. They're not even allowed to leave the hospital alone. What kind of, as well as the partner's grief, what kind of emotional and physical support do many of these women need following miscarriage and particularly medical treatment? Jessica?
I think there is an element of practical support which people forget. We had a case last Friday where we had to cancel a surgical management of miscarriage because someone couldn't find an escort to go home with because their partner wasn't available and hadn't had the time off work. So I think that's huge. It kind of varies depending on what the situation is, but as Munira said, after an ectopic pregnancy, especially increasingly we're managing ectopic pregnancies expectantly with repeated blood tests to monitor the decline in the hormone level over time. And people often will be coming back for blood tests repeatedly, and often they will want either the practical support of their partner, or let's not forget, if they're looking after children at home, then they also just need the logistics of sort of being able to get to these appointments, which are often at inconvenient times. There's this concept in ectopic pregnancy where you do blood tests at 48-hour intervals, which is never achievable exactly within the NHS, but actually what that dictates is that people, if people have blood tests at 9 a.m. one day, they're expected to come back for a blood test for the similar time 2 days later. So that can have an impact too.
We heard testimony from one woman who had to drive herself to A&E and nearly bled to death. You said that in instances of miscarriage, it can be life-threatening. The difference that it could be made if their partners were given bereavement leave at the same time isn't just mental and emotional, it's also physical as well. Yeah. Could you elaborate a bit more on that, Vicki?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's about having that support network in place. So it isn't, yes, there's the physical aspect of it in terms of the practicalities, having someone with you when you're having surgery, perhaps someone with you to go to appointments. There's also that aspect of, when people are going to what they think is going to be a routine appointment and then they're given bad news about their pregnancy. And if their partner hasn't been able to be with them, that person can often be in a real state of shock and aren't necessarily hearing what the clinician is saying to them or not necessarily taking it in. It's really crucial that if they have someone can be there with them to try and help them assimilate the information they're being given, that the choices they might have to make. And they have to make some very difficult decisions, very, very early on. So, partners are absolutely crucial in this process, and they, shouldn't just be seen as a support network, but they do play a very important part in doing that.
David.
Thank you. Munira, the third sector in particular have argued that reliance on sick pay after pregnancy loss can be hugely damaging for women and their partners. Can you explain a little bit as to why that might be?
I think using the phrasing of sick pay covers over the realities of what's happening for a lot of women and couples when they go through pregnancy loss. I think that it reinforces the stigma. I think it's not an illness, if I can put it that way. Pregnancy loss is not an illness in the traditional sense that we all know it, where you get a diagnosis and you get treatment and you get better. That's not what pregnancy loss entails. And I think that by using that terminology, it can be quite restrictive for people not being able to talk openly about their experience of pregnancy loss. And that certainly feeds into the workplace as well. If you're going into the workplace with a sick note and sick leave, then I think that the approach is quite different to having a conversation around bereavement and loss and all of the attendant emotions that come alongside that. I think sick leave is quite narrowing, and I think it, in some ways, minimises the experience of pregnancy loss for people. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Vicki and Munira as well, Are you aware of employers not following the ACAS guidance on recording pregnancy-related absences separately, and are women facing unlawful workplace discrimination as a result of employers not following that process?
Sadly, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, we've heard it all too often, really. We did some research 4 or 5 years ago now, which we will repeat and we will share with the committee. But 49% of those who responded, and we had about 700 respondents, who said they weren't aware of pregnancy-related leave or their employer didn't tell them about it, and therefore their sick record was impacted. So it was recorded as normal sick leave. We have a story of one woman who spoke to us and had been called in for disciplinary hearing because she'd had multiple losses, and so her absences had totted up. So that was triggering now, a meeting with HR. She was so distressed by her kind of recurrent loss and her experiences that she ended up being dismissed while she was on leave because she just didn't have it in her to fight it. She just couldn't. And there's so many other people as well. 11% of the people who responded to us said because of the way they were treated and how their leave was treated, they ended up leaving that employer altogether. And these are, by no means isolated stories. We hear it all the time from people just kind of saying, even when they have pointed out to their employer that actually this should be recorded separately, the employer not understanding that or not imposing that. So I think it's incredibly difficult for people. And as Munira talked about earlier, for lots of people, they don't feel sick. They don't see it as an illness. It's not. They don't see it should be on their sickness record. They're not having time off necessarily, or not all of the time off they have is to deal with physical symptoms. So recognising it as a bereavement, I think, would be really helpful to the people who are going through it. But it also would be helpful to HR professionals and employers who can, it gives it a very clear understanding of why that person is away. You wouldn't be calling someone into a disciplinary hearing if they'd had a bereavement, and it's the same experience.
What's the issue here? Is it that employers are not aware of the guidance, or are employers choosing not to follow the guidance? And if they're choosing not to follow it, do we know why?
I think it's both of those things, but I think it also goes back to, should this be recorded as sickness or should it be something else? Should it be a bereavement? And if it's being considered a bereavement, we don't have to worry about sickness rules being rightly or wrongly implemented.
Munira, did you have something to add?
I was going to fully echo what Vicki said. We've had examples where, I've got a few here, where someone was told by her employer, if I don't come in to do my shift, I would lose my job. And similarly, somebody went back to ICU following a complication with their ectopic pregnancy. And again, she was threatened with losing her job. And she'd been in, and I think from memory, that was somebody who worked in the health service. So we do hear of those instances, and sadly, those are just a couple of them.
Yeah, I've got a few more here that I'll read out if that's okay. My work is such that I didn't feel I could take any time off to manage the miscarriages, so I worked through both of them, which was really hard. Somebody here told us that I was told because there was no body, I wasn't allowed compassionate leave. I had to attend disciplinary meeting because of sickness due to my miscarriage. It was my fourth. I ended up going through an attendance management process with my manager and HR because of the time I'd had off by the time I'd had a third miscarriage. My employer asked for evidence, which was really distressing. The evidence went to admin and I was really embarrassed by this. My line manager ended up monitoring me for a month after my return, even though she was great when I first disclosed it. She gave me informal time off, but that made me more depressed and anxious to return. I wish I could have had a formal route to do this. Somebody else said I was given a disciplinary for attending the hospital. These are not unusual comments that we receive.
Thank you. Rachel.
Yeah. I mean, quite often we hear of women telling us that they feel that they're to blame for their miscarriage or their ectopic pregnancy. Given this sort of attitude from employers, Jessica, can I ask you, do you think this is partly causing some of the mental health issues that women are facing?
I think that's a really difficult question. I think generally the way society deals with pregnancy loss is causing it rather than specifically employers. I think, we have to go right back to even the terminology we use in miscarriage, miscarriage being that the carriage of the pregnancy is at fault. Miscarriage, you didn't even notice it. There's incompetent cervix thrown in. I think this, and it's not just that. On the flip side, when you are pregnant, you get constantly bombarded with all the things that you are allowed and not allowed to do, in terms of what you eat, how you sleep, not having hot baths, all these sorts of things. And so it's completely understandable that when you miscarry or have an ectopic pregnancy, you turn that on its head and assume that you were responsible for it. So I think it's a huge issue rather than necessarily in the hands of the employers, but society at large, I would say, in terms of the mother feeling that responsibility for the safekeeping of the child.
Thank you. Jessica, I just wanted to ask, obviously, we've talked a lot about partners, we've talked a lot about ectopic and molar pregnancies, but I wanted to talk about losses following IVF, which is incredibly important for same-sex couples as well, and people with fertility issues. Could you talk a bit about that, please?
I think it's a huge issue, and actually I'm so glad you raised it, because I was hoping it would come up, because I think it's really important to acknowledge that failed embryo transfers, which aren't classed as pregnancy losses in the traditional sense because the pregnancy test is never positive, are felt often as acutely as any other loss. And indeed, going back even further from that, you now have a situation where people can have unsuccessful egg collections where the results from that egg collection are incredibly disappointing. And so I think you guys have a decision to make about sort of what you include within the remit of this bill, but I would say failed IVF is a really important one, especially in view of the fact that actually, as you say, some of the marginalised groups are maybe more likely to be affected by it.
Could you talk a little bit about the physicality of that? We've understood, and I think we've heard very much the physical results of pregnancy loss, but I think in terms of IVF and the specific instances that you've raised, if you could talk a bit about that as well, that would be great.
I mean, the physical impact is less because you haven't got, the point would be that you've not become pregnant, so you might have some marginally heavy bleeding or some pain, but the emotional impact is immense. A lot of the time people have put their entire life savings, borrowed lots of money behind the hope of this pregnancy, and it represents that kind of complete loss of hope from often following many years of trying miscarriages, ectopic pregnancies. So it's this culmination of all this hope and effort, and it's absolutely devastating. There was a study that came out earlier this month actually looking at PTSD in the aftermath of fertility treatment, and it's even higher than my study suggested.
Thank you. Catherine.
Thank you. Thank you for all your answers so far, panel. It's really enlightening. So moving on now a little bit, if we may, to the more the areas around statutory reform and what we want to change there. And this is for you, Jessica. In its women's health strategy, the last government said it would look at what more could be done to support families after marriage and pregnancy loss. What should the new government's priorities be in this area, would you say?
As in by the NHS at large, not related to...
Or by the government, what should the government be doing? I guess I could ask you directly, do you think we need to see a change to the employment rights bill, for example, to include pregnancy loss and baby loss?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. No,
I think it's a straightforward answer. I think it's really important with all of the consideration around this, though, that you don't make people who don't feel that they need that leave. You don't alienate those people, because there will be a group of people who deal with this as a as a reproductive mishap, and actually we have to be careful in the way we manage these things that we don't make those people feel like an anomaly or like they're uncaring or don't deserve to be a mother in the future because they deal with it like a
different way. Yeah.
So I think it's also really important just to bear that in mind in terms of how we deal with things.
Would anyone else like to comment? Vicki?
I happily go. So, as I understand it, under the proposed employee rights bill, we're now looking at a period of bereavement leave for people in general who lose a loved one in general. So that will be in place. And then we already have parental bereavement leave for anyone who has a loss from 24 weeks onwards. So now feels like people who are experiencing pregnancy loss are the only ones who aren't included in bereavement leave legislation. And that feels incredibly unfair. It feels incredibly isolating for the people who are going through it. It feels like it's extending the taboo and stigmatising even more than there is already. So we would very much want to see the Employee Rights Bill amended to have specific reference to pregnancy loss before 24 weeks and some rights in there for those people who are very sadly going through it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If I may just add that I would endorse it be up to 24 weeks to cover the entire range of losses that happen at anything from early gestation up to 24 weeks, and not have an arbitrary cut-off somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
Back to Jessica's point, perhaps including and making sure that IVF is included in the definition, I guess, there. Munira first, please. You supported Angela Crawley's bill that would have given 3 days statutory paid leave for pregnancy and baby loss before 24 weeks. India gives people 6 weeks actually off. Do you think 3 days is a sufficient minimum standard?
Not by any stretch, no. It was heartening to have a proposal put forward by Angela Crawley and her team, and to have the conversation around pregnancy loss leave, and for it to be a step in the right direction. I think 3 days is a very short space of time, and you're barely managing the physical aspects in that time frame, let alone any of the emotional upheaval that's happening. So while it was a step in the right direction, I do think that a long time frame is more appropriate.
Would you like to comment on that, Jessica, from a medical perspective?
Echoing very much what Munira said, a lot of the patients with ectopic pregnancy have had laparoscopic surgery, and there's a duration of time that needs to be for physical recovery before they can go back to work. I guess then the question is whether that should be considered sick leave rather than bereavement leave. But from the perspective of my research, actually, my research only kicked in at 1 month, and we were showing such high levels of psychopathology at that stage. So 3 days sounds pretty token in that context.
Thank you. So, Vicki, first, please. Should employers be encouraged to adopt flexible policies to suit individual circumstances?
Yeah, 100%. And I would echo what Jess said earlier as well about not imposing feelings onto people where they might not exist. So it's really important, and we talk to employers about this all of the time, that pregnancy loss is seen as a unique experience. Many things can have brought them to this pregnancy, which then can compound that loss or affect how they might feel about that loss. People will need different things depending on their general levels of resilience, how they perceive their loss, how they deal with it, the support networks they have at home and elsewhere. So any policy that is in place, while should offer hopefully a standard kind of guideline to what people can expect, but we would still want to see a level of flexibility. It may be that the person needs less leave than that. It may be that they need more than that. But it also doesn't just stop at leave. The employers need to have an understanding that because somebody is back at work, it doesn't mean that it's all over now. They've dealt with it. Yeah. There are ongoing physical and emotional problems, and there are ongoing trigger points as well that people will experience.
Thank you. Just to follow on from that, is there a risk that if you have a prescribed statutory leave period, that could actually dissuade employers from adopting potentially greater, better policies?
I don't think so. I can see why that would be a concern, but I think good employers will always want to do more because they recognise the value in supporting their employees and giving them the time off they need to recover and giving them good support back to work. It means they come back to work in a much better place. They're able to work better to their normal levels. They work to a much better standard. They're less likely to take more time off overall. There's really good reasons to go above and beyond what the minimum prescribed is, and I think good employers will not be dissuaded from doing that.
Okay. And just the last one from me on this section. Should the NHS be doing more on research and prevention here? I guess that's probably for Jessica. Or is it?
I'm going to be very biased in my answers. Of course they should.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what I'm very behind in my day to day. I think actually what was just occurring to me as Vicki was talking, I think that this whole idea of it being very individualised is so important, because actually for a lot of people going back to work is an important step in their recovery, but if they can be supported for their duties to be amended accordingly. And where I deal with this with my patients who unfortunately sometimes work in the field that I'm in, which is obstetrics and gynaecology, you know, for some people going back onto labour ward in the context that they've just lost a pregnancy might be especially difficult, or going back into the early pregnancy unit. And I think having that, the employer's understanding to also, in terms of when they're ready, they want to come back, but they want to go and do something that's not pregnancy related, that should also be supported.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? Any follow-up? Anyone? No? Okay. Thank you very, very much for your time and for all the people's experiences that you have drawn upon and their pain. Hopefully we can see progress. And as we started at the beginning of this session talking about the stigma and how we need to actually have conversations about people's pregnancy journey, and that this is sadly part of it for many, many women. Thank you so, so much for being here and for sharing your experiences and your organisation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
For your time today. We'll be hearing from Rachel Suff, who's the Senior Policy Advisor from CIPD, Nicole Basra, the EDI Director for UK and Ireland from Dentsu International, Rhea Wolfson, the Head of Internal and Industrial Relations at GMB Union, and Thomas Simons, the Chief Human Resources and Operational Development Officer for NHS England. Thank you all and welcome. Before we start, I want to declare an interest that I'm a former GMB employer and still a member. I will hand over to Rachel.
Thank you, and thank you to all of you for sitting through the first section of our evidence and for coming along today. Rachel, first of all, could I ask that the results of the CIPD's 2022 survey showed that there were considerable gaps in employer support for pregnancy loss. What were the key areas of concern in that?
Yeah, quite a few. And I think the research we carried out, and we surveyed both 2,000 employers and also around 300 people at work who had sadly had lived experience of pregnancy and baby loss. So we got both sides of the picture. And I think what it really showed overall is that gap that the previous panellists have talked about, that gap in workplace not just support but an understanding, including around what the legal situation is. So, for example, we found that just 18% of employers record absence related to pregnancy and baby loss outside of the normal sickness absence reporting system. So therefore people could be subject to the use of triggers, adding to stress and so on. We found that according to employees, people who've been through this, that under half felt supported by their employer. We found that around 1 in 4 considered leaving their job, and only around half were able to tell, had the confidence, felt able to tell their employer about their experience. In terms of employers, just 1 in 3 had a policy, either standalone around pregnancy and baby loss, and it was usually part of another policy, and helpfully it was sometimes part of a maternity policy, which could not be helpful for some people. We did find still stigma and taboo, but I do want to emphasise there were good stories as well. We had some heartbreaking testimony from some people where they hadn't received support, and that went for partners as well. But the difference that support makes, it made a tremendous difference in areas such as people's mental health, commitment, loyalty to the organisation, intention to stay, and performance as well. So real mutuality of outcome where support is provided. I mean, lots more findings, but I'll leave it there.
Do you think there's evidence of the situation improving?
Slightly. So we carried out separate research again in 2022 through our annual Health and Wellbeing at Work survey report, because we were interested in looking at pregnancy and baby loss, particularly before 24 weeks, as part of what support do employers provide for people throughout the employee life cycle and across the range of reproductive and women's health issues. And what we found in 2022 was that asking HR professionals, do you provide support around pregnancy loss, miscarriage, or stillbirth, so not differentiating. 26%, so around a quarter, said yes, we provide support to a large or moderate extent, and then a further 36% said to a little extent. Our last survey, which we published at the end of last year, we've seen an incremental improvement. So instead of a quarter providing support to a large or moderate extent, that's gone up to 37%, but obviously that's still a minority.
Okay, and I think that covers my next question. Can you provide more recent data? Have you got that in a form that you can submit to the committee?
Yes, we can submit those headline findings. We've also got another survey going into the field in the spring.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And the next question to Nicole and Thomas. Beyond your own organisations, do you think the wider HR sector is beginning to understand and provide support for pregnancy loss as a workplace issue? And are you able to give examples?
Shall I start? Thank you for the question. So I think the survey data from the CIPD, the 2022, showing that 37% have formal processes in place as support and policies in place is a good start. And we see some really high-profile organisations like John Lewis and Banking, Monza, etc., Channel 4 and Media. So some big organisations stepping forward and saying this is a really important issue for women and their partners. And I think that's increasingly so in the conversations that I'm in with other organisations. So we obviously want to see that translate, and the NHS wants to take and is taking, I think, a leading role in trying to model what needs to happen in all sectors. And so my kind of sense of those conversations is it's moving, but we want it to move quicker.
Nicole, have you got anything to add?
Yes. I do think, compared to maybe 10 years ago, that people are more and more talking about it now, and I think it's definitely more in the news and more in the press, and so I do think there's definitely a movement here. When we started, and maybe I need to give some context to Dentsu, not many people potentially know what organisation we are. We're a global media and marketing agency, so we have about 72,000 people globally, and in the UK we're just over 4,000, and obviously compared, looking at the industry, is a very young industry, so there's probably many people within our industry that actually, experience pregnancy loss. I mean, listening to the research and, how many people are affected, 1 in 4, the numbers obviously are going to be quite high. When we thought about implementing a policy like this, we did, of course, look externally as well. When you present the business case to your business, they want to know what best looks like, what other organizations are doing. So we, for example, at the time worked within a charity called Working Families Together. They have done a lot of research in the space to kind of see what good looks like. We looked at some of our partners and clients. At the time it was Co-op and Channel 4 that actually were leading in this space. And they did 10 weeks. And when we launched our policy back in October 2021, and we pulled our business case together, I felt like there was definitely a movement there, and other industries would start to get onto that.
You've both touched on some really good examples and some really good employers, but do you think this is sort of happening across the board now, or is there still a long way to go?
I think there's probably still, I mean, listening to opposite the panel beforehand, there's still a taboo around the subject. It feels a bit like, people are not willingly, openly wanting to come up. There's obviously a cost, the economy at the moment is difficult, obviously organizations always want to talk about the cost associated to it. I think it's a movement, but I think there's definitely more that needs to be done.
I'd concur. I still think it's a area where there is stigma and it's not taught openly by employers or employees. And I say that with the NHS still on that journey, as I think we heard about just a moment ago. So we still have more work to do, but I think the wider economy and different sectors do as well.
Thank you. Rhea, the next question's for you. What's been the take-up of the GMB's model employer charter?
Thank you for the question. So we launched GMB's Pregnancy Loss Charter only just in October at the last Baby Loss Pregnancy Loss Awareness Week. And so already we're engaged in negotiations where we've got recognition with a number of local authorities and one very large food manufacturing company. So it's positive that it's there and we're pleased to have presented it, because I think policies like our Pregnancy Loss Charter, which you can find on GMB's website, are really important to supplement the law. It's really important that we're talking about changing the law to create a much more solid floor for rights, but it needs to be more than that. We need to talk about organisational culture. We need to talk about how managers are trained, how we speak about these issues, making sure that we are listening to workers, that the experience that allow them to lead. And we put a lot of emphasis in our policy around the experience of partners and future co-parents, because they are impacted very significantly by pregnancy loss, and it's really important that they're part of that. So it's positive, but we've got a very long journey to go, I think, before we get large employers to reflect anything like the level of rights and wrapper and care that we're advocating for.
I think it's important for our research to see some really good, positive examples of successful implementation of your model of a month's leave for pregnancy loss. Are you able to share some with us?
So we are only in a process, as I say, it takes a long time to promote new policies, and we only launched this charter back in October. So what I'd be really happy to do is come back and report when we've had some successful landing of that policy, and talk about how it has impacted. But what I would say is there's a reason that we're asking for a month. There's a reason we're talking about a month, and it's because I didn't sit in an office building this policy. It was built by our members that had experienced pregnancy loss and came to us and said, this is really important. I really want to talk about the frankly terrible experiences I've had at work, because I don't want anyone else to have to go through what I've been through. It is about, and we can talk about, so I'd like to talk about some of that testimony if I get an opportunity. People being put through processes that have been mentioned a number of times, not just dealing with absence triggers, so that's very, very important, but also just dealing with the basic fact that some people, when they go off sick, are not paid, and then they go into statutory sick pay. It's a huge financial burden for some people to be off sick and to be put into a sickness absence policy rather than a bespoke policy. So I would love to come back and tell you about the positive impacts when we have been successful at ensuring this implementation, but it is another reason why we're advocating for it to be a statutory minimum as well.
Thank you, and thanks for the work that you're doing in this space. It's really important.
Thank you, Rachel. We will have a chance in a bit to explore the NHS and Dentsu's different policies, but David, did you want to have a follow-up question?
Thank you, Chair, and just refer to my declarations of interest. I am a member of the GMB. You would have heard me talk in the first session with the first panel about the impact on partners of a couple suffering from a miscarriage or baby loss. What guidance is out there for how employers should treat partners when they're in that sort of situation, if any? And I can put that to any of you over to you.
Shall I?
Thank you.
No, go.
Well, yeah, we've got guidance for our HR members that we produced with Miscarriage Association and others with lived experience and Tommy's as well. We've also got guidance for line managers and for colleagues, recognising that all areas of support in the organisation is really important, and partners and concern and support for partners comes through really strongly, as does a whole focus on inclusion in terms of how you treat pregnancy and baby loss, in terms of what type of loss, recognising everybody's different experiences and potential family makeup. But in terms of partners, we've got provision around that. And I think it's so important. So often it came through to us that partners' needs were just completely overlooked. And they could be really feeling traumatised, the mental health impacts as well. So we really urge inclusion around partners and proactive support provided to them, because they're very likely to be grieving too. So really important element, and it runs through all of our guidance.
So just to very quickly follow on from that, if I may, Chair, Rachel and Rhea, do you find many employers putting in provision for partners or following that guidance? Maybe you first, Rachel, and then Rhea.
The really great ones, Co-op has already, and we've worked with Co-op, that they've already been mentioned. Yes, their support is just as available to partners, and also for partners giving paid time off to attend medical appointments with the physical birth mother as well. So that is really important, making that practical support and leave available. And Angela Crawley's bill that we were really supportive of as well, that made provision for partners, and we would be supportive as well for that statutory leave to be made available to partners as well. But I think it's very variable. I think where employers are doing really good things and providing really good support, then yes, they are being inclusive. They're working with organisations like Miscarriage Association and developing really inclusive policies, but it's not across the board.
Rhea, did you have anything to add?
It's not our experience that it's widespread or common even to see employers implementing policies that support partners and recognise what they're going through. I think it's worth pointing out the wider context that we're sitting in. If you think about kind of what we would say the pretty dismal state of affairs around paternity leave and the rights associated with that, never mind going on to talk about pregnancy loss and how it affects everyone. I have one quote here from a member who works in the NHS, and he said, my wife had multiple miscarriages a couple of years ago now, and the support I got from the trust was none. I had to get a sick note with stress, as the trust policy didn't believe families should have compassionate leave. This needs to change. And what we see is when you don't have proper policies in place, you just push people into another policy. So people end up taking sick leave, they end up in a worse physical and state and dealing with mental health issues that maybe wouldn't have happened if they'd had a very swift intervention, a compassionate and person-led intervention from their employer in the first instance. And that's, experiences even in big employers like the NHS, where they should have a much greater awareness, but it's very, very uncommon from our experience to hear positive stories of active support from employers for partners and prospective co-parents.
Thank you, David. Kiris.
Very quickly, thank you. I just wanted to know what more could the government be doing to try and increase and raise awareness about some of the pregnancy loss and some of the pregnancies we talked about in the first panel, sort of raise awareness about those, and also in your views, how far does the Employment Rights Bill go in providing some of that support? And that's to anyone.
Well, I can give a bit of a summary of the things that we considered before introducing what we have done in the NHS, which is a policy framework for women experience loss, but also for their partners. And David, I really welcome that question, because it's one of our sort of big learnings. And I think there are three big things that we've considered. What is the impact, and what do employees want and need in terms of support, and what does the employer, what are the interests of the employer in introducing these kind of supportive interventions. And then there's a kind of question about, well, what is the cost of introducing those kind of measures. And our assessment on all of those three dimensions is that yes, it's in the interest of employees, of course, absolutely the employer, and the cost is pretty marginal, and that's even without thinking about things like retention, turnover. And so for us, that was a decision that was the right and appropriate decision for the NHS to make. But I think for government and for this committee consider it, there'll be other broader considerations, size of organisation, the type of absence arrangements they have in place already, and I guess more broadly the kind of modern workplace and kind of type of society we want to be in, really. So that's, I guess, feeds into your thinking.
Did anyone else have anything to add to that? Rhea, did you have something to add?
I think we're, in terms of the Employment Rights Bill, which is a very positive thing that GMB really welcomes and is excited about so many parts of it, we don't cover this issue sufficiently. It's just not, we don't have the basic safety net is not there for people who are suffering pregnancy loss, and we class that as miscarriage or termination before the 24th week of pregnancy. Those rights just aren't there. They're not included in the Employment Rights Bill, and we do need to look at that because having those statutory rights creates a floor, of course, and it's vital. Sometimes they create ceilings, but that's the way our employment law is set up, so I don't think we should be too scared of that. But it also increases awareness of the issue and helps reduce the stigma, because a lot of one of the comments we have from a school support staff member was there's no support unless you ask for it, so women are just forced to carry on like nothing has happened. And that was a really, really common thread of the testimony we had. I just picked up and got on with it because I didn't know that whether my employer would be sympathetic, whether I would have access to anything, whether I would be told to go home because I'm therefore not paid. And that's a very scary prospect for people at work. And so that floor of rights is absolutely vital. And I think we're talking about people's physical safety. We are talking about their mental health. We're talking about trauma. These are big issues. And I think we're pretty far away from actually tackling them head on. And I think tackling them on in statute is really important.
If I can add to this as well, I think government, I think, can really help to raise awareness around the topic as such, because, as I said, like, people still don't really talk about it. I have personal experience, and when it hit me out of nowhere, because there was just nobody really talking openly about it. So I think number one is raising awareness and actually having it opening out there, that actually so many people are affected, and doing a bit of an education around the subject. And I mean, of course, I do think that people need time to grieve. And 24 weeks is a very late time to offer that support, because people suffer a lot, much prior to that.
Thank you. Yes.
Can I just add on that as well, because I think it's a really important question. We would also be really supportive of putting in place that statutory floor as well, and the Employment Rights Bill seems like a really good opportunity to do that, and the clause dealing with bereavement is the ideal place, because, as previous panellists have said as well, sickness, and it came through in our research, sickness absence just isn't the appropriate, helpful way to deal with this kind of loss and grieving. So we would really support provision for a certain number of days paid pregnancy, loss, miscarriage leave, definitely. Also, it would help to raise, if there was that statutory right there, it would I think, help to raise awareness of the need for compliance on the part of employers, because still far too many women can't get that, or partners can't get that basic leave, and also I think it would help to reduce the stigma, some of the stigma around it as well, because it's there, it's a right. You don't have to go and quibble or ask or beg or, or worry and stress about what you can get, because it's just there and it is available. And then feeding into that more broadly in terms of what the government could do, because again, I think now is a real opportunity. We do have a women's health strategy. I don't know whether that would be revisited with the new government. We've got Women's Health Ambassador. I think having even more focus on the workplace, the role of the workplace, because actually a lot of people talk to people at work. Sometimes, I've had several losses, and sometimes it's really hard to talk to the people you're most close to. It can be easier to talk to the people at work, actually. Plus, people do have real friendships at work. So I think the workplace is such an important place to provide support, reduce stigma, and so on. We've seen tremendous progress around menopause that was so heavily stigmatised. We can do the same for these other really important workplace wellbeing issues. So I think the NHS can play a really great role as well as an employer, as well as obviously your health service. So we'd be really keen at CIPD. We've got really evidence-based, really thorough guidance informed by experts and lived experience. We'd be really happy to develop that more broadly.
Thank you, Rachel and Nicole, both of you. I'm very sorry for your losses. I would say, I wanted to just push back on Rachel and just say, could you share that research with us around the feelings of why sick pay is not applicable and it's not suitable? That would be really useful. Thank you. Rosie.
Thank you, Chair. I think worth mentioning before I move on to my section that Nicole mentioned creative industries and Rhea was talking about no pay, but of course a lot of Channel 4's employees, for example, will be creatives who are freelance. They're not going to get sick pay at all if they go through this and then decide themselves how long they need out of the workplace. So I think perhaps we could sort of look at that in the report as well. I'm going to talk about the NHS miscarriage leave scheme now. Thomas, this section is for you, if that's okay. What proportion of NHS trusts do you know have implemented the miscarriage leave policy since it was introduced in March?
Thank you. So the kind of work that we started on pregnancy loss was actually started in Birmingham Women's and Children's in 2021. So they started developing supportive policies back then, and it started sort of gathering some momentum. By the time we started responding to the review from 2023, it'd already been kind of adopted by about 30 to 40% of NHS trusts already. So there was a kind of, I think, a movement of understanding some of the issues, as you would hope, in National Health Service and HR practitioners working in that sector. We introduced it at the beginning of this year. In March of this year, we then introduced planning guidance each year, which is a document which kind of sets expectations and priorities for the NHS as a whole. As you'll know, we made the adoption of the policy one of the priorities for all organisations. So we're about 8 months into our journey of adopting it, and Amanda Pritchard very much led that kind of, this is a priority for everyone to adopt. And we did a snapshot survey just before joining you, and about 80% of those that have responded to that have adopted or in the final process of doing so. And I hope you don't mind, Sarah, I took the to look in your constituency, and Milton Keynes have done it, Bedfordshire, Luton just about to launch it. So you can really see the evidence of it taking hold, but we're still in the early stages of that, and there's colleagues have mentioned the cultural aspects, and there's a really important thing about our policies. It's a national policy, but individual employers in the NHS need to adopt it, and that's important, although really supported by national unions, GMB and Unison and others nationally. We want that conversation to happen locally, because it's about the culture change and about the conversations that happen about this issue in the workplace. So that's the important part of the adoption.
Brilliant, thank you. So do you expect 100% of trusts to implement the scheme, and have you got any kind of time frame about how long that will take?
So that would be our aim. That's what we'd like. That's very much what Amanda has set out as a priority in the planning guidance. We're going to, as I said, we're about 8 months in, we're going to start a sort of formal evaluation of the work in April next year. Both about the level of adoption, but also have we got things right in it? You know, the number of days, the type of support. Already there are a few things that we're hearing about and thinking about that we sort of would like to evolve the policy. And I guess we'll see where we are, and we'd be very happy to share back that with the committee if it'd be helpful at a later date.
Brilliant, thank you. Because a lot of the questions in this section, and I know we're kind of pushed for time, we're really about the feedback that you're getting. But I mean, it is so sort of at the beginning, isn't it, the early stages. So have you had feedback yet that sort of imply that partner leave is going to be kind of taken up as well, and all these issues that we've talked about? Will the NHS try and look at those things? Yeah,
so I can give you some. So Birmingham Women and Children did a fantastic job in 2023 of independent evaluation of their policy, which was quite staggering in terms of its results. So just to give you some, so it was a group that hadn't access support versus those that had access to support. 85% of those that had felt valued versus 31%. Those feeling that they were physically supported in the workplace, 73 versus 40. Being able to talk freely on a 10-point scale, 6.9 versus 4.1, and we could share that Birmingham Women's and Children's report because it's incredibly compelling.
Brilliant, thank you. Just one last thing. What do you find so far have been the key practical and admin challenges? Maybe it's a bit early to tell, but have you come across anything that makes it difficult or that you've learnt from?
So first of all, there's no reason why practically employers can't put this in place. Okay? Right. So from an administrative, HR perspective, that's not a problem, and we haven't found it to be so. Okay? What we have learnt is that local adoption, local culture change, training leaders, managers, all the overcoming some of the stigma that we've heard about today is really at the kind of heart of whether this is successful. And I mean, we're hearing some really positive stories from staff who've experienced employers, local NHS trusts, who are really sort of leading the way in adoption. So I think we're encouraged by where we are. We're not complacent, but encouraged.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Did you want to follow on any others?
That's all right. Okay. Lots of information.
Thomas, can I just push on the finances?
Yes.
And you said it was a very minimal cost. What's the net effect, really, of the amount of paid leave taken? Has it had any kind of... what are the projected overall costs, really, for the Trust? Because I know that will be key to actually making sure that this finds its way across the entire country.
Yeah. So it's not an easy thing to model, because what we have, the evidence we've seen is that women and their partners either come to work when they're not, essentially when they shouldn't be at work. We've heard some really horrific stories from staff about that, or they've taken sickness leave as opposed to a more appropriate type of leave, as we've heard happen. However, we had it. We have a sense of the number of trusts that adopted it already. We're obviously at day one. Sickness, we have sickness provisions, payment provisions in place, and we looked at what the maximum level of exposure would be across the National Health Service, and we equated it to something like 0.01%. And that was without considering the benefits on retention, turnover, absence, staff engagement. We heard about productivity. So our, view, and that of Julian Kelly, our Chief Finance Officer, who spoke about this a while ago, was it was negligible. Yeah.
Thomas, that is going to be huge news, given the fact that the NHS is the largest public sector employer of women, to hear that it's such a minimal cost to implement something such as this without even factoring in the retention costs, as you say. On this, how long are you expecting, or are you putting a target for trusts, individual trusts, to have implemented your policy and to have taken it up? Because you said 80% of the respondents, that's not 80% of the trusts.
Of course.
So how long are you giving them? And is there going to be any extra support or incentives for trusts to join, to make use of this change in policy?
Yeah, so I think the end of this financial year is a good kind of stop-take point for us, because where there's local engagement and real discussion, debate about this sort of policy, that's healthy and good for employers. So from my perspective, it shouldn't be a sort of binary game of have you haven't this early on. I think as we move into the end of this financial year into next one, we would expect employers to have adopted the policy, and we'll have real data about that in April.
Fantastic, thank you. Kira, did you have a question?
No, I just needed to declare that I'm a member of the GMP and just to refer members to my register of interest as well.
And thank you. Thank you. Do you have any plans? I know that you've said to the end of the financial year. Do you have any plans to publish any of the assessments that you make on this policy and the rollout of it, and the benefits, as well as some of the barriers that you've managed to overcome as well?
Yeah, so we are. We're not waiting until the end of the year. We're obviously learning a lot about the policy and its adoption already. We do want it to be independently assessed in April, and any of the learning that comes from that, we really welcome sharing it with you if that was something you'd like. Absolutely.
Fantastic, thank you. Does anybody have any follow-up questions at all for Thomas on this? No, thank you. I'm going to move on to the private sector schemes now. Nicole from Dentsu. Before we start, I think the NHS scheme has been outlined. Could you just give us a brief summary of what Dentsu's policy is on this?
Yeah, sure. So we implemented our policy back in October 21, so it's been in place for a number of years now, and we offer 2 weeks of paid leave for anybody experiencing a pregnancy loss, but also their partner. So it's the same rights for everyone. And of course there's, in difficult circumstances, there's room for additional discretionary leave if need be.
And what have you seen in terms of the level of take-up by women and their partners for this since your implementation?
Yes, so we encourage, if possible, to ask people that experience loss like this to put it in leave or put it in our system as compassionate leave. So, of course, it's we didn't, at the time we thought about it, but we thought it was a bit insensitive to ask for specific reasons. So, and, if you look at compassionate leave, in any case, if you go through a difficult situation like this, people arguably potentially don't even put it into the systems. So, but I had a quick look, obviously, ahead of this meeting to prepare. So back in 2023, we had 238 people that took compassionate leave, and there could have been anything, I think the majority was 1 to 10 days, but we also had uptake up to a year. So it's obviously it's very difficult to kind of say, what percentage of that could be relating to pregnancy loss. This year we had 184 people taking off compassionate leave, and as I said, we're just over 4,000 in the UK. But my assumption is that people don't necessarily put it into the system. So again, in order to prepare for this, what we did, we have an amazing parents and carers community. This is an ERG that we tap into quite a lot, and they also helped us to pull this policy together at the time. So they have been really crucial in putting it through, because obviously you listen to your people, you listen to their stories, and our people, we're very fortunate. There's a very good culture actually there. We're a Japanese heritage company. We talk a lot around Sampo-yoshi philosophy, but in essence it means what's good for our people is good for business and it's good for society. So if that all works nicely together, everybody wins. So so we really, there's more that we can do, of course, but we're really trying to support our people wherever we can. So our parents and carers community is 600 people strong. So before I came to this meeting, we actually put a little question out there in terms of, how people have utilised it and any comments. I need my glasses because the light's not great in here. So, so now I thought I'd share some of the comments here with you. So. And as I had 5 people within a week that came forward and said like they've used the policies, which is quite good given the very short notice. So one person said, the support offered by baby loss policy has strengthened my loyalty to Dentsu as an employer. I felt my struggles were heard and validated. Allowing time off to rest and recover allowed me to return to work in a much better headspace and be more productive as an employee. And then in brackets, compared to when I returned to work following baby loss where there was no policy in place. Another person said it was incredible to receive the support. Having time to grieve and openly talk about the loss really helped me get through this difficult time. Another person, not only having to deal with the physical elements of pregnancy loss, but the emotional loss, it was great to know that Dentsu understood and supported me. Having time and space to give having time and space you need to grieve in the former capacity of a pregnancy policy is invaluable. And then in terms of, when you ask what benefits there are for a company, we talk a lot around loyalty, retain talent, doing the right thing. Again, in Dentsu, we talk a lot around doing the right thing for our people and actually supporting them in time of need, staff retention. There's obviously a lot of work that's done around mental health in general. So, yes, it's difficult to track how many people have used it, but, the culture kind of suggests that it's definitely there to be utilised. And I think, again, to the topic around the taboo, I do think, people would take the time off. So from a cost perspective, if they need time, it's sick leave. But sick leave, I think, you're absolutely right, doesn't address the issue. And so I think for me, having an open conversation around and addressing the topic really helps people to get through those difficult times.
Thank you, Nicole. I know that you said that it's difficult to identify the data split between compassionate leave and miscarriage bereavement leave for the way that it's recorded in Dentsu. So would you be able to say that since it's been implemented, it was in 2021, wasn't it? Has there been a change in costs? Have you seen an increase, or is it very minimal in the same way that Thomas outlined for the NHS?
I'd say it's very minimal. I think, as I said, if people need the time off, they probably book it off at sick leave anyway. And we are, as a private sector, so we are a multi-million pound business. So I think from a financial stability point of view, we don't think that would have impacted our financial stability. So there's no really that we can attribute directly to this. I don't think so. And from a culture perspective, I think that is the main thing. I think, and as I said, it does create loyalty, and in time when a company potentially doesn't do so well, so you hope you retain your talent. If you have the back of your employee at the time when they need it, you hope that kind of gets paid back eventually. So actually, arguably, you're probably in a good place, better place, if you can support your employees.
Thank you, Nicole. I was going to ask about training within Dentsu. It's obviously big and multinational. A policy is only as good as the people that are implementing it. It's probably extended to Thomas in a bit as well about the training that you're giving management, as Rhea said, about the appropriate language, about how you're using your policies and how you're there to support your employees in the best way that you can. Yeah. Did you offer implementation for training for this change in policy?
Yes, we very much do. And actually, to accompany the policy, we also developed some line manager guidelines, I think, which are really, really critical that go along with the policy. The line manager guidelines are very much, and as I said earlier, we're a very young organisation. Actually sensitizing your employees around, how often does it happen? What does that mean? What does an employee potentially experience going through a loss like this? What are hints and tips that you as a line manager can do to help your employee to get through this difficult time? And then signposting, great, obviously helpful resources with the Miscarriage Association or Tommy's. There's so much out there that actually, if you go through this, you don't want to search yourself. So there's actually lots of signposting done. So definitely education of line managers and helping them to, help their employees is really important. We do offer training because obviously a policy is only as good as people are aware of it. So we do offer, constantly we try to reiterate the fact that what kind of policies we have to support our employees, pregnancy being one, but we offer also fertility policy, for example. We offer neonatal care and a premature baby. So just to support people whenever it's needed. We have a great peer-to-peer support network through our parents and carers community, for example. People share their stories, actually, on our intranet internally and put themselves out there to be contacted in case of need. So, for example, if somebody, arguably probably the people sharing their stories, they hopefully, have time to deal with it. So they're able to kind of talk about this. But it's really nice. So I shared my story, and on the back of that, people came to me and asked me, and I was able to kind of be a good buddy to them. So the peer-to-peer support is really critical. We have mental health first aiders, we have an EAP, an employee assistance program. So signposting all of this available support, because people they don't necessarily come forward when it happens to them. No, they look for confidential people, like people that they can talk to on a one-to-one basis, rather than going out loud around what happened to them. So signposting this available support internally, I think, is really critical.
Thank you, Nicole. Thomas, did you want to add on the training of managers point? Is that part of the policy?
Yeah, so I mean, very similar. I would say that for the NHS we have a kind of very active programme around improving the experience of staff in the round. So we have something called a People Promise, which has been built from staff comments, and one of those is particularly around health and wellbeing, and the training of managers is core to all of that, and we've actually set out kind of manager expectations in the round around the kind of experience that staff should be having in National Health Service. So I think culture and experience is a sort of important umbrella for this work as well.
Thank you. And I just wanted to ask both of you, and possibly Rachel and Rhea, on this. Does all of your policies and your guidelines cover terminations for medical reasons at all? It does, Rachel?
Yeah.
Yes. Tom?
Yes.
Yes.
And embryo loss.
Everybody. Okay, thank you very much. Christine?
Thank you very much. Apologies for coming in after you started, but I wonder if I can ask you, first of all, to Nicole, what your view is on extending eligibility for 2 weeks statutory parental bereavement leave to employees affected.
Going beyond the 2 weeks?
Yeah.
Well, as I said, we have this discretionary support available in any case. Yeah. So if there's, if people experience, and we talked about flexible, right? I mean, people have different needs at different times, right? So I do think it's important to be flexible around this. I think 2 weeks is a guideline, and it's kind of it's the same as we all offer for compassionate leave, for example, if you lose a close relative. So it's aligned to that. Anything in that at the moment is based on discretionary leave, but we do, as I said, when I looked at my, the uptake, there were actually quite a few that went well beyond the 10 days. So.
Sorry, Thomas, you looked.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's really interesting. So the NHS policy is up to 10 days, and what we've seen so far from the evidence in Birmingham is where you create a very supportive environment where managers are trained, the employer is actively supporting this space. What has happened is individuals affected have come back in about, so far on numbers, about between 5 and 6 days. So there is something about the signalling of the leave and the support that is just as important as the sort of number of days specifically.
Yeah. Okay, I wonder if there are key points that each of you think you would like the government to bear in mind, or that you've learned that could be important, the sort of key thing that, if there were one thing that you would say.
I mean, we did touch on that a little bit earlier. No, it's around the awareness. I think having actually openly talking about this, and I was saying earlier, when it hit me out of the blue. And there's actually not much, unless you obviously go into researching it and then you find all this information and you talk to the NHS when it goes, and they wouldn't, at the time, I don't know whether that's changed, but at the time they wouldn't offer help until it happened to you 3 times consecutively. And then when you had a baby, you had to have another three miscarriages in order to get help again. So I think raising awareness around that is, number one, it happens a lot, and number two, what's available, openly addressing it. Again, when I went through my line manager had no idea. It was 10 years ago, so I'm hoping we're at a different place now. But she called me in the hospital and asked me when I would come back to the office. And even my friends, I love them dearly, but they would come to comfort me, and they would bring their young children, and it would hurt. And it's this raising awareness that the impact it has and how people are suffering, I think, which is really important. And time to grief, I think it's critical. I came to the office at 6 o'clock in the morning because I needed to avoid going into a room full of people asking me how I was, because I was worried I would burst into tears and not be able to stop. So I think, grief takes different amounts of time. But I think, if there's two things for the government, definitely help raise awareness around the topic and encourage organisations to provide leave for grief, to grief.
So definitely addressing the stigma and addressing that sort of front on, I think is really, really important. And the second I would say is probably around this kind of issue of not seeing this as a kind of cost, and seeing this as absolutely vital for healthy workplaces, and in the interest of the employer as well as the employee, and that balance, I think is really important. And probably lastly, the big learning I think we've had is to David's point about partners and the support that they need, but also to enable them to support the woman as well. I think we underestimated how pervasive that was as an issue in the implementation. So we've seen that, and actually men have spoken on a number of occasions to me about that being an important part of the policy change that we've made.
Yes. I think I'd add flowing. Definitely agree with both panellists, and just flowing from that, I think government could have such an important enabling role in terms of working with organisations like ACAS that provide such great advice and have got guidance already, but also membership and other organisations like NHS and trade unions and leading employers in the area, but just raising the importance and understanding of it, that it is a workplace issue, because I think some employers might just not see it as such, and that this is something, and we see it with other wellbeing issues, that this is something private, it's intimate, it has no place in the workplace. And yes, we know that some people might not want to talk about it. It is intensely, grief is intensely private and so on, but the onus is still on the organisation to recognise it as a workplace wellbeing issue, a really important one. And by creating that culture, that environment, even if you're not providing practical support is very important, but the second most valued type of support, according to people we surveyed, after paid leave, was understanding from my manager that it can be a difficult time. So, and it doesn't cost anything to create that culture, that environment, open up the conversation, so that people can seek support if they want to. And it will open up the culture.
Yeah, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I did. I want to come back to that missing floor again, that missing floor of rights, because I think this is such an important chunk of our legislation that's missing. It brings together how we often misunderstand or don't take seriously enough health issues that women face, discrimination that women face in the workplace. It brings those issues together, and it's so important. I have testimony from a member who works in the non-profit sector, and she said, I worked throughout my miscarriages and was given the option only to work from home, which was insufficient in my view. The emotional distress and the physically harrowing aspects of a miscarriage, particularly if the pregnancy is advanced. Additional time should be permitted for appointments, D&C procedures, therapy, without cutting into annual leave or other kinds of leave like bereavement. Pregnancy loss is unique and deserves recognition. And and policies, if not statute, that takes into account that grief is not linear. Anniversaries come about, and everyone is different. Everyone experiences pregnancy loss differently. But a floor of rights allows us to have a better quality conversation and a minimum standard that workers can expect, and raise that expectation that people can go into work, women can go into work and have their health taken seriously, their mental health, their physical health. And just coming back to your question, talked about 2 weeks. Well,
2 weeks, often people are still suffering significantly physically without even talking about the trauma and the toll on their mental health. Physically, depending on what procedures people have undergone, 2 weeks is not a long recovery period, and that's when you get into sick leave, which, yes, ties up with stigma, but it's really practical. People don't get paid properly. People might turn up to work, and it's a false economy because people will take the leave they need to take. They just might have to do it in a way that punishes them financially, or even causes them to potentially lose their employment altogether. And that's maternity discrimination packaged up in a different way that we're just not, I think, taking seriously enough yet. And I really welcome this committee hearing, and also that people here have shared their testimony. I know there'll be other people in this room that haven't, and that is so important for tackling the stigma, but also just saying we're going to take this forward really practically, because these issues impact so many people, and we've got something really fundamental we need to do.
Thank you. Christine, before you come to your last question, I know Rachel wanted to come in on the point that's been raised just now.
Yeah, I think you've sort of touched on this, and it's particularly for Thomas and Rachel. I think a lot of employers and line managers would probably say that they're ill-equipped to deal with these issues, and in the initial conversations that employees may have. Do you think there's a role for government, and particularly for organisations like ACAS or larger employers like yours, Thomas, to sort of push out a package of training to equip those line managers and employers, particularly small employers, with some of those tools really to be able to deal with those situations?
I think it's really important that large employers firstly work with their trade unions, work with employees to develop a package that is easy to use, signposts, enables creates a sort of environment where people are inquisitive to know more. I mean, this is an area where, because it has been stigmatised, people haven't talked about it in the workplace, employees and employers. And so, what we've done in our kind of policy framework is, of course, given the kind of the details you expect about how many days, etc., but also said this is where you can access more information. This is where the video is that you can see more from Tommy's, etc. And then I think it's for local employers in the NHS context to work that through on the ground with line managers. But it may be that a line manager doesn't encounter that issue, experience. It could be over intermittently, might be once in a year, or so it needs to be comprehensive enough that they can take it off the shelf and go, okay, what should I be doing here? What are the things that are important? And then be able to deal with things compassionately.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think it's absolutely crucial that line managers feel confident, comfortable and capable to have those conversations, because they play such an integral role in terms of supporting people's health and well-being in a number of ways. They've got the day-to-day contact with people, they'll be managing the work, they'll be managing absence, return to work, day to day. And I think it's true in the NHS as well, isn't it, that they will have that relationship and be implementing all those policies. So their role is just multifaceted, but obviously they're very busy, and often they're not given enough training, the investment, and also in terms of issues like this, many will feel unconfident. So that's why we produce specific guidance for line managers. It's really accessible, practical, and breaking it down into knowing what to say. We've got tips of things that might not be helpful to say, because what we find is that silence is stigma, and very often is because people are afraid of saying the wrong thing, because they might not come across this issue very, very often. We don't know what line managers themselves are going through either. So that guidance, this is how you bring the policy to life, and how line managers can bring that policy to life is critical to the support that person will receive, because they will be the ones that should know what policies can come into play, like flexible working, reasonable adjustments. They'll know what support should be available, so like a gateway for all the people management policies, and signposting where there's an employee assistance programme, not to use the trigger system for absence and so on, but it has to take place within that context of a trust-based relationship with the individual. So absolutely critical, the role of line managers. But they're not counsellors or experts, medical experts, and that's why they do need training. Otherwise, the risk is that they will stray into trying to fix the problem, give advice, and they shouldn't be doing that.
Thank you. Nicole?
I'm very conscious of time, but just briefly to ask, is there any danger, or people might suggest to be an unintentional consequence of extending leave that it would dissuade companies from, say, the GMB policy charter? It might have a counter effect.
I think we need minimum standards. That's how our employment laws say minimum standards, whether it's minimum wage, whether it's statutory sick pay, statutory maternity leave. We need minimum standards, and we need more than minimum standards, but I guess that's where trade unions and collaborative working come in, where we advocate for stronger policies that have that wraparound supports, whether it's guidance or in language, or whether it's training or access to counselling, buddy systems, any of that. But I don't think it's a strong argument to say that there is a risk if we introduce minimum standards we won't get more. I think if we don't introduce minimum standards we won't get minimum standards.
Yeah.
Just to be clear, GMB are suggesting that, and what I've heard across the panel, is that you would like to see this written into the Employment Rights Bill, or that would be a good place to start.
Yeah, we do think that there's more in our charter that is not statutory, that it's really important to look at and we'll be advocating for, but there are basic rights that we do think should be considered in the Employment Right Bill. And can I just make one comment, because I've missed it? I think it's really important, because we haven't really talked about the intersectionality around this issue, which I think is really important, which is, yes, pregnancy loss effects. We've talked about women, we've talked about partners, but it's worth highlighting that some people are more likely to experience pregnancy loss, including black mixed heritage women who experience a much higher rate of miscarriage. Disabled parents may experience more pregnancy complications and impact on their physical and mental health. And LGBTQ plus people may have more complicated fertility journeys, in many cases more expensive, and different routes to pregnancy. And so a policy like this is really important for lots of different communities, and I think that is really important to highlight.
Thank you. Does anybody have any follow-up questions or final questions? If not, I'm going to ask each of you in turn just to summarise your final points, what you would like to see, or what the benefit has been to your organisation for implementing miscarriage bereavement leave. Rachel, I'm going to start with you, and it's about a minute each, if that's possible. Thank you.
Well, just to focus on that last question then around what would we like to see from the Employment Rights Bill and what statutory change, is there a case for it? And I think in this case there definitely is. Legislation doesn't always solve the problem. Sometimes it doesn't always do enough to change employee behaviour. And we've talked a lot about the need to change the culture in organisations as well. And I think that is really important, what Tom said about it's not just a number of statutory days that you're allowed to take in leave. That's right, it's everything that goes around that. However, I think in this case there's such a cliff edge in terms of that gap in statutory support that it really needs addressing. At the moment, it's so stark. Literally, from one day to the next, you could have experienced a loss. The differential in terms of what you're entitled to by law is so big that there is a really strong case for just improving that statutory floor and giving everyone the right to, before 24 weeks, at no matter what stage, because it can be just as devastating, some statutory basic provision for leave.
Thank you very much. Thomas?
So it wouldn't be surprising for the NHS to say, we're really, we think what we've done so far is a really good step in the right direction, particularly affecting women and their partners. I think that's important. It's still really work in progress for us. Some of the things you just mentioned, or some of the areas we're sort of grappling with about things like surrogacy and things like that we haven't been as clear as we want to be. So there's definitely work for us to continue to do, and good employers will do this work because it has a positive impact on employees and their organisations, both of them. And I think the question around whether it needs to have statute to strengthen it is a question really for whether we think employers in the round will take this forward because of the things I've mentioned, there's no interest to do so, or whether we will need a harder lever to make that change and change the kind of stigma. And I think that's ultimately the question that government will be considering.
Thanks, Thomas. Rhea?
Yeah, we want to see a statutory floor of rights that applies to workers experiencing pregnancy loss, which we define as unexpected or unexpected end of pregnancy before the 24th week through miscarriage or termination. And obviously as a day one right. And we want to see employers adopt policies like the GMB Charter on pregnancy loss to ensure that wraparound support and guidance, and to ensure that it's all employers, no matter their size, are best supporting all workers that are experiencing pregnancy loss directly through their partners in whatever role they're playing.
Thank you. Nicole?
What I would like to see, I think, just to reiterate again, is, for me, is definitely the awareness around the subject, and also the leave, of course, before 24 weeks, at any point in time. As soon as you find out you're pregnant, you start to imagine your life, and that is a loss. And if you can align it to, if a company has compassionate leave policy that is 2 weeks, why would that be different? Why would pregnancy loss be different? So I think for me, definitely awareness and the leave benefits for us for Dentsu. I mean, speaking as an employee of the organisation of Dentsu, I feel incredibly proud to work for an organisation that actually puts their employees first and cares for them and supports them in time when it's needed the most. From a personal perspective, it would have meant the world to me if I would have had support at a time when I needed it. It is really tricky, and 10 years down the line it is still triggering sometimes. So I do really applaud you for really trying to push this. I know it's been on the radar for a number of years, so I really applaud you for trying to make a change and make the world a better place for people who experience loss in that way.
Thank you all, and thank you for all the work that you're doing too, and for coming to share the experiences of the people that work in your organisations that seek your representation every day. Thank you. Or if there's anything that you think you want to follow up on that you didn't cover, or any specific research or text that you think that we should have access to, please forward that on to the clerks. It would be really useful. Today I had said in the private session that this was a particularly heavy topic. For anybody watching, and for all the panellists and everybody here, please be kind to yourself today. This has been a really powerful session, but as outlined, incredibly necessary. Thank you very much. That brings proceedings to a close. Order.